Today we got some educational reacts chat. Educational reacts. So today we are watching a video called Where Did the Australian Accent Come From? Where did it come from? As you guys know, that if you watch me, you probably know I'm Australian and all that. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's get into it. Where does the Australian accent come from?
Accents are weird things, aren't they? Like, I understand why different people from around the world end up speaking different languages, but why on earth have people ended up sounding different depending on where they come from? Why do specific places affect the way we speak? It seems that accents come about when people have been living together for a long enough period of time and pick up on
True.
specific speech patterns from one another until eventually everyone in the community speaks in a similar way. Accents are way more than just the way we speak, however. Not only can an accent signify where we come from, but it can also signify what socio-economic background we come from too. In example,
Facts. That's so true, bro. That's so true. Like, like say UK for instance. Someone that uses very proper English, maybe, you might call them posh. They're probably from nice areas. And someone that says, bruv, brev, probably, lower economic area. That's just how it is usually. Like the more slang, like the more slang that's incorporated, more slang words instead of like proper English. You know what I mean? Two different social classes, good, like that's a big signifier of that.
rich person and a poor person from the same part of London will most likely speak differently. They're truly fascinating things. This has of course led to some accents being more beloved than others. Undoubtedly, however, one of the most beloved accents has to be the one this video is all
Let's
about. That being the
go,
dialect spoken by
Australia.
those from the land down under, the Australian
Yeah,
accent.
yeah,
It really
yeah.
is one of those accents that pretty much everyone knows straight away, and everyone has attempted to do it themselves with varying degrees of success. What I find most
Yeah, it's bad.
interesting
I've
about
heard
this
some.
accent is that it's not entirely native to the land. The modern nation of Australia is primarily made up of descendants from settlers from other parts of the world, much like other nations
The
like the USA
convicts.
or Brazil. This is different to many other nations, which have inhabitants that have lived there for many years and have accents that are native to the land, like French and Irish in example. So, where exactly did the Australian accent come from? To start with, the official language of the nation should give you a pretty clear idea as to where this story begins. While Aussies speak
England.
English, Australian English has very much become its own unique thing.
Yeah.
Not only do they speak English, but the Union Jack is part of their flag too. If you
You speak bloody Australian, mate. You
haven't
speak
guessed by
Australian.
now, Australia and the United Kingdom are very much interlinked nations. Australia was in fact a colony of the British Empire from 1788 until 1901. This explains to us not only why they speak English, but also shows us how exactly that famous accent started to take shape.
Yeah.
As mentioned, the British colonization
Bro, even if you watch like media, like like Australian media, especially like news anchors, say like even in the 70s and back, Australian media, like it sounds very different, very like proper. And that's what they would want, like on the news anchors, all that proper English, like very proper type stuff. Today it's a lot it's very different.
of Australia started in 1788. It was in this year that the famous
Captain
First
Cook,
Fleet arrived
Captain
in the
James Cook.
continent. This fleet of 11 ships left Portsmouth in the southeast of England on the 13th of May 1787, carrying over 1,000
Bro, that's insane. Like these guys are using sail ships back then, like 300, between 300 and 400 years ago. They got here. Look how far that is. Oh my gosh, that's insane to think
400
about.
inhabitants to their new home. At this time, Australia had no European settlements, so making the land habitable was quite the challenge for the people
Yeah, they didn't have any European settlement, but the English aren't the first Europeans to like land on Australia. The Dutch actually landed on Australia before. I don't know how many years before the English settled, but they were on the other side. So the English landed in like near Cronulla, Sydney, Botany Bay. That's where it landed, which is like Cronulla today. Like yeah, Botany Bay and Cronulla is two different things. Botany Bay is still a place. It's still called, but it's down there near Sydney. but the Dutch discovered like Western Australia, which is a lot more hot and a lot less greenery on the western side.
On these ships, on these 11 boats, were a huge variety of people. There are high-ranking government and military officials who'd be running the operation once they landed in Australia, but these officials brought their families with them too. On top of this, you had the ship's crew members, but also people who'd fill important roles once they arrived in the land, like builders, cooks, and various other workers. Though most famously, of course, are the convicts on these
Yeah, the
boats too.
convicts,
There were thought to be around 700 to 800
bro. Like just part of the Australian school system. We learn about this in primary school and stuff. And yeah, poor fella, and this was during like a famine, bro. They were still a loaf of bread, and then they were like, "Yeah, you're getting locked up. All the prisons, jail, and all that was all full. So yeah, you're getting sent on the other side of the world." And it's so crazy to think about in the past. It's like, obviously the convicts they didn't really have much of a choice that they were getting sent away, but all the other people, like the government, like they bring the whole family. And this is 300 years ago, over. All your family back at home, you'll probably never hear them or see them again during your lifetime, you know what I mean? And it'll be very interesting for your future generations to see if they still got a connection with, your family from back in England. Most people would probably never see or hear about their family again, just from the fact that, they don't have the technology like we do now. It's crazy to think about.
convicts aboard the 11 ships of the First Fleet. They were being sent to Australia simply due to the growing amount of prisoners in Britain. This is something we covered in much more detail in our video about Tasmania's strange
Oh,
name, so go
Tasmania.
check that out. To summarise, the British Empire used Australia as a plaster for their prisoner problem, rather than fixing the problem outright. Australia wasn't just a dumping ground for Britain's convicts, as various stereotypes like to depict. Regardless as to why there were convicts in Australia, they definitely were there, as well as many other people, from fancy government officials and their fancy families to other various workers who were enlisted to create this new colony. All these people would have come from different parts of Great Britain and would have come from different social economic backgrounds.
That's crazy though. Sending some convicts over built Australia. Australia's not a bad place. I mean, there's a lot of things that aren't good and things that aren't, going down the best direction in this country. But considering this is where they started, it's crazy to think about. Like this is how it all started, and now Australia is the way it is. Crazy to think about.
Too. This meant that not only did this huge variety of people arrive in Australia, but their huge variety of accents arrived in the land too. Great Britain is home to many accents and dialects, despite its relatively small size. One source pointed out that there were up to 300 different accents on this island. These
That's
changes in voice can be seen on a large
that's crazy though. Like with Australian accent, right? There's probably a few main ones. There's a few, but like this is so crazy, and it's like I would say it's because of how long these people have been in these areas for. So you can travel like an hour up north or south or whatever, and then it's completely different. And also like I'm just talking about English speaking countries like the US. It's very different state to state. You know what I mean? But Australia as a whole, it's pretty similar, but there are some very major differences. But yeah, like he just said, there's about 300 different ones. That's insane.
scale when comparing someone from the north of England to someone from the south. However, there are even slight differences in the way people speak in counties right next to each other. Even people
Counties.
from different boroughs of London can speak differently. It's an island full of a staggering amount of accents, and an
Scouse,
awful lot of
Yorkshire.
these accents made their way over to Australia with the First Fleet. In the 18th century, people didn't travel as much as they do now, especially people from lower economic backgrounds. This meant that many of these people may have never heard some of these other British accents before, let alone
True.
understand them. Communicating with one another became quite a challenge, and when you were literally on
Really?
the opposite side of the earth trying to create a new community from scratch in the blazing
We gotta learn
Australian
how to
heat,
speak to
you
each
kind
other.
of need to be able to communicate with one another efficiently. From the fact that Australia is still around to this day, we can gather that these various people did manage to communicate with
Worked
one
out.
another, despite the disparities in their dialect. How did they do this, however? Well, something happened to the way in which these various British people spoke their language. This something is known as dialect leveling. Dialect leveling is something that happens in the world of language and linguistics, in which various distinct variations of a language strip away the things that make them distinct for ease of understanding. Words present in one dialect but not in another would be removed.
Oh, so it's just meeting in the middle with your words. Like you just meet in the middle and like combine different dialects and then remove some and just meet in the middle. Okay.
And other words that are pronounced differently in different accents would be leveled out and be said in a way that fits all the different dialects and accents. Removing all these quirks and traits in a language and getting to the bare bones of it really help people who speak the same language but in vastly different accents and dialects communicate with one another. And this is exactly what happened in Australia
Early
and
Aussie
set the wheels
accent.
in motion for the birth of the Aussie accent. This birth didn't
Aussie
happen overnight,
accent.
however. It was after 50 years from that initial European settlement of Australia that the accent that we all know and
50
love started to
years.
appear. Those initial settlers still alive after 50 years would have undoubtedly changed the way they spoke, but the real change of the accent would have come with descendants, the kids and
Facts,
grandkids
the
of the initial.
kids. Like that's when it'll really start because they grow up hearing that and that's all they've ever known. That's all they've ever known. So that's when the ball really gets started and really gets started with the new accent.
Settlers who would have spent their entire life in the accent melting pot that Australia had become. These children would have really sounded how Australians sound today. Of course, it was a huge mixture of accents that went into the creation of the Australian accent we have today, though some dialects and accents are seen as being a bit more pivotal and had a larger influence in the sound of the speech today. It seems that the South East English accent is seen as
Southeast
one of the key
English.
players in the Aussie accent. This makes an awful lot of sense. The first fleet left from Portsmouth, which is in the southeast of England, and the southeast is one of the most popular parts of the country. The southeast houses London, so many important figures and convicts on these boats would have
Oh,
arrived from the
okay.
capital. More specifically in London, we have the Cockney accent too. Cockney is
Cockney.
seen very much as the precursor of the Australian accent. There are definitely similarities between the two, that's for sure. Likewise, Scottish is seen as having a large
Scottish.
influence on the Australian accent too.
Scottish.
However, there's one huge omission I haven't mentioned in this video yet, and that's the native accent of the
Aboriginal.
Australian Aboriginals. I've read conflicting things as to whether their accent affected the Australian accent. Some
But I mean, yeah, but the thing is, tribe to tribe, like there was over 300 different dialects. Like each tribe would have their own dialect, their own language. So I don't really know how that would be. You know what I mean? Because yeah, each one had a different language, and it's interesting for me, just speaking about this, because where I'm in right now, Northern Territory, like Darwin, and that there's a lot of Aboriginal people, and lots of them are from communities, like rural communities, and they still speak their native language and English. But you hear them speaking their native language. It's very different from down south. You never really see that down there.
say it had a direct impact on the way Aussies speak, while other sources point out that it's the other way around. While Aboriginal names and words are very present across Australia, it seems that accent isn't quite as abundant. Pretty much as soon as the accent emerged, it was instantly beloved. What's even more surprising is that when it first came
Yeah,
about, Australian English and their Australian accent was seen by scholars of the time as the purest
the
form of the English
purest English.
language. This purity of the Australian accent goes back to the dialect levelling we mentioned earlier. The
Oh,
people
okay.
of Australia had come to speak English without any of the local quirks that plague the various forms of English spoken in the UK.
Oh, okay. It's purest English because they had to remove all the little, twang and stuff like that to meet in the middle with everyone. But now it's not really like that, bro. Because even sometimes, like, there's been times I'm like on Omegle and stuff like that, Omi TV, like the random chat things. You just randomly talk to people, and I'm on there, right? Especially to like people from like US people from the States, Americans. I'm like, g'day. I'm all, hey, yon, hey, yon, hey, yon, hey, yon. And they're like, what? What are you saying? What are you saying? I was like, how are you going? But to them, they don't say going. It doesn't make sense to them. Like, how are you going? Or it's like, do you mean where are you going? Or how are you doing? How are you doing? But we say going, like, how you going? And they don't understand.
all because this accent and way of speaking was born out of a means to communicate easily and efficiently. Author of The Story of Australian English, Kel Richard, explained it
Kel
best, saying that
Richards.
Australian English is English with the dialect variations taken out. Unfortunately, this love of the Aussie accent and its position as the purest form of English wouldn't
Didn't,
stay around for too
yeah,
long.
did not
Across
last.
the 18th and 19th century, some huge changes were made to the English language and the way in which it was perceived. The most noticeable change was the introduction of the concept of received pronunciation, known as RP for short. RP is named by many other names: BBC English, the Queen's English, and Oxford English, to name a few
Oxford
examples.
English,
It's
Queen's
that
English.
definitively British accent spoken by the likes of the Queen and those who present the news on BBC. It was in this period of time that RP was put on a pedestal and declared the definitive way of speaking the language.
This is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about even if you look at older media, like news anchors from the 70s and past, they spoke very proper. That's not really a thing. That's not a thing anymore, really, because most of the time news anchors now they just sound like anyone else down the street. You know what I mean? But back then they really pushed it, sounding very proper and stuff like that. Because yeah, the average Australian would not sound like news anchor if you saw like one from like the 1960s. But today, you hear these fellas, and then you hear another bloke, like average person on the street, they probably sound similar.
Not only was it seen as the definitive way of speaking English, but those who spoke with this kind of accent were seen as superior to other English speakers. Those who didn't speak like this in not just the UK but across the empire in general were looked down upon. It's worth noting here that
So it's like a
despite being
status
seen as
thing.
the stereotypical way in which British people speak to this very day, very few British people actually speak in RP on a regular, everyday basis. It's pretty much just the royal family and the rest of the upper echelons of British society at this point. Despite
All
this,
right.
however, it meant that the once beloved Australian accent had gone from being seen as the purest form of English to being a rather harsh, rough, and coarse accent.
Yeah,
Sorry,
a bit
Australia.
rough.
Soon enough, RP was being taught in classrooms all across the empire,
How do you
including
teach it?
Australia. Not only were young Aussies being taught to speak like this, but many posh Aussies started to use RP too
Posh.
to distance themselves from their traditional Aussie accents, what was seen as unpleasant sounding in the time. Even once the
Unpleasant.
country gained its independence from the UK in 1901, people were still trying to speak with an RP accent and sound less Australian. All this brings us to today. Luckily nowadays there isn't as much stock put into RP, and by and large people aren't shamed or judged for the accents they have, at least they shouldn't be anyway. Luckily
No, they don't really care. Like generally, like it's whatever your accent, it's whatever.
for us, RP's boost in popularity in the 19th century didn't wipe out the Aussie accent. Though what's so interesting about this dialect is that in its roughly 200 years of existence, not many variations of the accent have actually emerged. There are a few variations of the Australian
Variations.
accent, and the variations that do exist aren't particularly related to geography, like the accents of the UK or USA in example. The Aussie accent really doesn't change that much depending on
Facts.
where you are from. Most sources
Yeah, it's really true. I would say the biggest ones are like generally it doesn't change a lot, but there's a couple of bigger differences, like say people from like that live in a very urban area like a city compared to people that live out in the country like more rural. Those are probably the biggest differences in accents, you know. And I feel like people from Melbourne, down South Victoria and that, they've got a different accent. Like the people in the city in Melbourne, they've got a different accent. Like, and I'm just talking about Australian, right? Australian, just the typical Australian accent. And I'm not talking about because in of course there's more different accents because there's like Australian like African accent, Australian like say Australian like Polynesian because obviously say they're first generation in Australia like say I know down south in Melbourne there's lots of Sudanese and lots of these Sudanese people like my age they're like firstborn like first generation Australian or they came to the country very young and of course so their parents have a very thick like Sudanese accent still because they've only been here like 20 years 10 years and that but they, but obviously their kids that are growing up here, outside they hear the Australian accent, and then at home they hear the like Sudanese accent from their parents, right? This is just example. So it's a bit of a mixture. Like you can hear the Australian, but you can also hear the influence from their parents because the kids are like first generation in Australia, right? And that goes for like lots of other like different Asian, Polynesian, all different types as well. So that's like another one besides country, besides like country, rural Australians, and then city Australians. There's like another subset of stuff like that. Parents being from overseas and stuff like that.
Claimed that there are just three different versions of the Aussie accent, and these are more defined by social economic background.
But yeah, these he's going to talk about the main three, like. But I was just talking, like using Sudanese people as an example. That's like a subset.
As opposed to geographic backgrounds. These three are called general, broad, and cultivated. General Australian is by far the most common Aussie accent you hear.
General. I don't know what I got. I mean, I've talked to some people like this. Again, this is just like on the rent, like Omegle type stuff. Like when I talk to people from overseas, like the US and that, they're like, "Oh, you sound like Crocodile," or "You sound like Steve Irwin." Or like even I remember I was talking to this person from Adelaide. Adelaide have a different people from Adelaide. They pronounce words a bit different. Like not even the accents, the pronunciation. They say dance, prance instead of dance. Like yeah, let's dance. They say dance. That's an Adelaide thing, South Australia Adelaide thing that I've heard. Not saying everyone from Adelaide speaks like that, but that's just a thing that they do. They say dance down there instead of dance. I don't know why. Yeah, I was talking to this fellow from I don't know who I don't even know if it was a girl or not, but I know it's someone from Adelaide. And like they said to me, I don't know, they were like, "Are you putting on your accent? Like, is that real?" I was like, "Yeah, that's just how I talk." And then they're like, "You sound like you're putting it on, like you're trying to sound like Steve Irwin or something." But yeah, I think yeah, I don't know what I'll be considered as. I mean, I have lived like rural, not like on a freaking farm, but like I haven't lived in a city like 10 coming up 10 years next year, like, I've been living in, rural, like, small town. And before that, I lived my life in the Northern Territory, which is more like, I mean, in Darwin, which is a city, but it's more like, I would say typical like Crocodile Dundee type stuff, Northern Territory. So yeah, that's probably, yeah, that's just my accent. Like where I've lived and stuff has an impact.
Here. It's the way in which the vast majority of the nation speak. Someone like Hugh Jackman is a prime example
Hugh
of this
Jackman.
kind of Aussie accent. Broad Australian is the accent
I don't. Hugh Jackman's from he's from Melbourne or Sydney. He's from Victoria or New South Wales. I'm not sure. Broad.
spoken by people living in more rural areas, part of the nation that are more isolated and would have been less affected by RP and its influence.
I think I've got a broad. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It's either general or broad. But yeah, like 10 years. Like I've been living rural, rural area, small town for like since I was 10 years old, 9 years old. So yeah, coming up 10 years in like a rural place. Before that, Darwin. You know. Yeah.
In the 18th century. A great example of a broad Australian accent is with Steve
Steve
Irwin.
Irwin.
Cultivated Australian is perhaps the
Yeah, I think I'll probably be leaning more towards broad. I reckon it's broad. It's between these two. I don't know. It depends who you ask, but yeah, I don't know.
least Australian
And it depends. It depends. If I really like, I could probably like adjust it a little bit, but yeah, I'm thinking probably more towards broad. Yeah, but I guess like the way to really tell is someone outside of me, like not me, because I always hear my accent. Maybe like if I talk to a city person, right? Like someone that lived in the city their whole life. Because city people are usually like general, I would say. I mean, general is legit general, like most people have it, but if I talk to a city person, right, like from Sydney or whatever, ask them, they'll probably have a better say on it. Because if they talk to me and I sound like every other person that here in the city, it's probably general. But if they can tell I sound a bit different, it's probably broad. It's probably broad.
Australian sounding of these three variations, it seems this accent is 19th
Um,
century. A great example of a broad
Steve
Australian accent is with
Irwin,
Steve Irwin.
Crocodile Hunter.
Cultivated Australian is perhaps the least Australian sounding of these three
Oh, the
variations.
least
It seems
Australian.
this accent is most linked with the high society of Australia, those whose ancestors did in fact pick up on RP all those years ago. I read that Kate Blanchett is a prime example of someone with a cultivated Australian
Cultivated.
accent. In all honesty, I didn't even know she was an Aussie. The history of this accent is an interesting one,
I
that's for
don't know.
sure. From
Cultivated.
being born out of necessity for easy communication between people from vastly
That's
different
cool.
backgrounds, to being considered the pinnacle of
That's
English, to being
fresh.
shunned thanks to RP, to being the beloved accent it is to this day. It's even evolved more so to become its own thing, with unique Australian words and phrases. In fact, you could call this form of English and the accent sweet as bro. That's what they say in Australia, right?
Sweet as. I feel like that's more of a Kiwi thing. Sweet as. Sweet as cows. Come down to the dairy. Come down to the dairy. I went down to the dairy. Nick Monut. Bro, when I was younger, probably like season, like I remember Fortnite season 8, chapter 1, season 8. I used to sound Kiwi, bro, because I don't know. I would just sound like I was, from New Zealand, Kiwi when I was younger, because I would talk to people on voice chat and they would think I'm from New Zealand. That's when I was younger. I don't know. I think I was putting it on a bit, but yeah.
Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explained on a monthly basis.
WVid, bro. I like that. I like that. But yeah, I think I'm pretty lucky with the accent, right? Like, because yeah, like example, yeah, again, like the Omegle type stuff. When I talk to random people, they low-key get excited sometimes. They're like, "Oh, you're an Australian." I'm like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Oh, can you say chuck a shrimp on the barbie?" Oh my gosh, say shrimp, it's a prawn. But the reason they say it is from an ad back in the 80s or 90s with Paul Hogan, aka Crocodile Dundee. That's Crocodile Dundee's like the real guy, Paul Hogan. He done a ad, Australian ad for tourism marketed towards Americans. So that's why he said shrimp, and that's where it all started. Shrimp on the barbie, Paul Hogan. Paul Hogan, shrimp on the barbie, and yeah, bro. Like especially Americans, they're like, "Oh, can you say shrimp on the barbie?" I'm like, there's been times I say it, and there's times I don't. Or like, what's it called? G'day, mate. You know what I mean? G'day, mate. This is the one I'm talking about real quick for context.
G'day. Thought I might be able to see America from up here. You're just across the Pacific, you know. Hello. Looks like a boatload of your countrymen coming in there now.
Your countrymen.
Right. And a plane load. Better fill the icebox and fire up the barbie. Because Aussies like to make you feel at home.
Aussies like to make you feel at home. Statue of Liberty.
G'day, viewers. Just
G'day,
been telling the
viewers.
Yanks how Australia's the
G'day, viewers. Just been telling the Yanks.
best place for a holiday.
G'day, viewers. Just been telling the Yanks Australia's the best place for holidays. G'day, viewers. Just been telling the Yanks that Australia's the best place for holidays.
And the friendliest place on earth.
And the friendliest place on
Beaches are
earth.
crisp and clean.
Crisp
Beer's
and clean.
cold.
Beer's
There's plenty of
cold.
shrimps on the barbie.
See, this is where it all started from this freaking ad, 1984.
The least we can do is make sure everyone's smiling. I'm not asking you to rent out the spare bedroom or anything. Just flash the pearly whites and say g'day to a visitor.
G'day.
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 Come on. Don't make a liar out of me. Just
This is-
flash the... I'm not asking you... Everyone's...
This is where it all
There's
started.
plenty of shrimps on the barbie. Clean, beer's cold, and there's plenty of shrimps on the barbie.
There's plenty of shrimps on the barbie. That's where it all stems from. It all stems from this ad, bro. Chuck a shrimp on the barbie. Put a shrimp on the barbie. Shrimp on the barbie. All that's
nations
where it
like the
came from. That's where
USA.
it originated from. That add towards the Americans. But yeah, bro, I think I'm pretty lucky with the Australian accent. Yeah, because most people say like hear it and they're like, "Oh, you're Australian." You know what I mean? Say, but lots of other accents, like say, typical, American accent. Someone hears it from different country, they're like, "Oh, you're American." But Australians, they're like, "Oh, you're Australian." And I want to get overseas, like next year, 2026, for like Christmas, have a white Christmas, like snowy, either Europe or the US or Canada, one of those. I'm gonna save up lots of money during 2026 to do that. I want to because I've been overseas. I mean, I was born overseas. I was born in the Philippines because my mom's from the Philippines. I've been to like Philippines, obviously Australia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand. I think I was a baby though, so I don't remember. But the only countries I remember is Australia, Philippines, and Malaysia. I stayed one day in Malaysia, lay of flat, had to stay there for a night. But yeah, I've never been to it. Besides Australia, I've never been to an English speaking country besides Australia. English is first language. So I feel like if I go to US or Canada, I think I'll get lots of leeway over there just from my accent. Because I'm like, g'day, or like I need some help. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I'll be lost in that, and I'm just like, well, I just yell out, oi, like, g'day. Oh, quick question. Could you tell me where the nearest bloody train is? Nearest bus stop? I need to get, to the other side of town. They're like, oh, you're Australian? Yeah, yeah. I think, no, like, I think I'm set though. If, say, yeah, just the US for example, I'm set. Because I got an Australian accent. Like, I'll be like, oi, mate, can you help me out real quick? I'm a bit lost here. I'm a bit lost. First, I just, second day here, off the plane, fresh off the plane. I'm a bit lost. Like, do you know anywhere to get a good feed? And they'll be, oh yes, yes, of course. You're from Australia. Oh, nice. Yeah, bro. I think I'm set because of the accent. It helps. Yeah, I think my accent helps. But yeah, bro, that's the end of the vid. WVid, educational reacts chat, an Australian watching a video called "Where Did the Australian Accent Come From?" I think I'm probably a bit. I think I'm broad. I reckon. I reckon I'm broad, bro. I think, or general. I don't know. Probably abroad. I mean, I live in a rural place, small town. So yeah, like lots of people sound like me around there. But yeah, bro, that's the end of the vid. Hope you enjoyed. We learned about the Australian accent, and yeah, thanks for watching.